Welcome to Lost the Podcast. Come for the... Oh, crap.
Oh,
I don't know what to say.
wrong one.
This is Changeling the Podcast.
Wait, we are always Changeling the Podcast. It's still Changeling.
Yes. Okay.
What are we talking about tonight, Fuka?
We are talking about Changeling the Lost. But like
Yeah.
in a general sense, not specifically
Yeah.
the core book or any book, just the game in general, because as we proceed through the wilderness time between Changeling the Dreaming 2nd edition and the 20th anniversary edition, Lost came out in that period, so we are covering it as a point of historical concern.
Yeah. We might come back to it later on another episode, but this is a very sort of high-level discussion on how it fits in with Changeling the Dreaming and the like.
Or doesn't, as the case may be.
How it relates to... There are connections on a meta level, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
So what is Changeling the Lost?
So for context, at the time we're talking about here, so we talked about this when we covered Time of Judgment. The notion of ending the entire universe was this radical one for tabletop role-playing games in general, honestly. So then when they immediately kind of undercut it a few months later by launching the New World of Darkness, it was like, what?
Yeah, especially the first one they launched was Requiem, which really felt more like a
new edition almost.
Well, it's bigger change than even like 5e, like V5 or whatever. Like it is definitely not the same game, but it's also very similar game. Like
I don't think they intended to hoodwink people, but I do think there was that moment of letdown because it's like, oh, here's the Gangrel, here's the Nosferatu. I can't remember which clans are in the core book, but I think that faded very quickly when it became clear that first it was not going to be the same game. And I don't know, I feel like it's almost adding insult to injury that they used so many of the same terms for such different things.
Well, we can get into that with Lost too. They continued that.
But then also after Vampire, I think it became clear to those of us who were Changeling players that like, oh, Changeling's going to be a long time coming.
Yeah, they did the same order. Well, sort of. They skipped Wraith. They did not do Wraith to something or other.
So and don't get me wrong, I love Promethea. But
it's not the same game at all.
Yeah,
it's not.
Yeah.
You could also argue that what's the other game? There's another game that's also at least as much Wraith as Prometheum is.
Well, Geist is like
Geist,
the equivalent, but
yeah.
But regardless, I think also having kind of the bitterness around the way Dreaming had still recently at that point been strung along before being smothered to death, and then in connection with this on a, I don't know, personal note, I know you also have this experience, is that when they rebooted the World of Darkness, they shut down the White Wolf forums. And that was, I think, for a lot of us, that was like the last vestige of like, okay, cool, I still have people who are also into this, who I can game online with. And then that was gone. So it was like all the avenues to express my love for Dreaming were just kind of shut down without any fanfare. And they did, I think they did introduce NWAD forums, but it's like, okay, well, only Vampire players are going to care about that, at least at first. Finding Shadow and Essence and finding other spaces to express these things was helpful. But that's the context in which...
Yeah, and it was, well, it's now called Chronicles of Darkness. It was called World of Darkness. It was very confused. When you talk about New World or Old World, those were not official terms. They just started calling it the World of Darkness, this other setting that vaguely resembled it, kind of, but not really. Like, it was similar enough that they would get sued if some other company had done it without permission, but it was not... Yeah.
A bit confusing.
Yeah, let's get into Lost specifically, though.
Yes. Changeling the Lost, August 2007, when the first edition core book finally got released as the fifth in the line after... Let me see if I can remember these. Vampire the Requiem, Werewolf the Forsaken, Mage the Awakening, Promethean the Created. Right?
Yep. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I almost joined a Changeling the Lost game, LARP
Ooh.
actually, but the game was starting up in 2008 because like the books had to come out for a bit, people had to digest it, and then I had my first kid, and something that happens to a lot of first-time parents is they don't realize just how much time babies take up.
Yeah, I've heard this. Yeah.
So I was going to do it with the mom, and we are going to play in this Changeling the Lost LARP, and that did not happen. So,
alas. Well, speaking of waiting for the books to come out, Changeling was intended, like Promethean before it, and like Orpheus before it, to be a limited run line of 6 books. But then because it was so popular, it ended up getting, I think, a full dozen in the first edition.
Yep.
And then 5 more in the second, the last of which, as of this recording, came out yesterday. So it feels a little bit apropos and bittersweet to be doing this recording today. So it's weird, like Changeling is once again over. I don't know how to feel about that.
Once we go through the whole C20 thing, we can also probably sum up everything going on there. So that's maybe when we're done C20.
Yeah. So in your experience, like I found most of the players of Changeling the Lost were not players of the Dreaming. Like it immediately found a fan base, but there didn't seem to be much overlap.
I would say so too. This LARP I was going to, they're like, "Oh, there was another game? Oh yeah, I heard about that. You played that one. You ran LARPs for that? Okay." Like it was all different people. Like the people I knew, like the ones that I already knew, I knew through like vampire LARPing. They were not connected at all, which was interesting. But also a lot of new faces at the time that I didn't really know because I only went to like the one session 0 and then
I don't know if my experience is in any way typical, but like, so I still bought all the books and read them voraciously, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't have much opportunity to play it in the early days because by then, like, I was done with university, which was where I did a lot of gaming.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I still appreciate it, but like I've said before, I don't think I truly loved it until I stopped wanting it to be Dreaming, which took a long time. Like it was fine, but it wasn't Dreaming.
For me, okay, so I actually really liked Awakening. I never really got into 2E, by the way.
So I hated it.
I mean, I hated the color they used on the background. It was so hard to read, but I loved Awakening, and I was actually thinking of running LARP for that too. And I ran a Forsaken Chronicle, and that was a lot of fun. I'm not a big Apocalypse fan, but War of the Forsaken I loved. Promethean, I wanted to run games of it, and I almost happened kind of things a bunch of times. Like this is all when I was still running Changing the Dreaming LARPs at this point. And then Lost came out. I'd already been like seeing enough of the other things. I was not expecting Changing the Dreaming. That didn't bug me. I just didn't like the 1E core book.
Okay.
Like I found the writing very dry and dull. I never finished it when I was trying to read through it the first time. Like the second E core book, I haven't fully read it in detail, but I'm really liking that. An interesting setting. But it's just something about the 1E core book tone or something. It felt like I was reading like a boring textbook, not a role-playing game that was interesting to me.
So I wonder, to some extent, I think this is maybe a good opportunity to segue into talking about how NWAD was constructed.
Yeah.
Because...
Or should we say Chronicles of Darkness? I don't know.
Well, I don't think we should because we're not even there yet.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Oh, yeah, it's true. I backported it all to be Chronicles.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a couple of the design goals of NWAD, it was very clearly spelled out from the start, I think, because we saw how cobbling things together over time with Old World of Darkness didn't always work out. So they kind of ditched the punk energy of Old World of Darkness, which I don't know how you feel about that. Like to strip out the punk from Gothic punk and only leave the Gothic.
I mean, that was pretty much stripped out by Revised, in my opinion. Like it was, I don't think it was very punky by
perhaps.
Yeah, like that's a very early World of Darkness take, I'd say. Like the goth punk World of Darkness that I would say a bunch of places in the...
Yeah. I don't know. I think Changeling made it pretty easy to keep in, but
yeah. Anyway. They stopped highlighting it at least.
That's true, yeah. In any case, NWAD was also very metaplot light, which I think reached its peak in Lost. I mean, each storyteller and table kind of decided what the world looked like for their game. And aside from the courts, I don't really recall much sense of unity. Like, a sense of a society that they were operating in.
Yeah, the whole thing was supposed to be very regional, like very city based. That actually works well for a LARP in my like if you're not a network LARP, just individual LARP.
Yeah.
It was interesting. It also it felt a little bit cookie cuttery to me in some ways. Like they have this formula, and all the games follow the formula. I mean, there was not just World of Darkness, or not just White Wolf doing that formula thing at this point. There was all sorts of didn't like 4e D&D, 4th edition D&D come out at some point.
Don't get me started.
Yeah, which I know a bunch of people love they love 4th edition D&D more than on any other version of D&D, but it's a very different game.
There's one thing that I'll say in favor of 4e, which is that they did publish, and this is the only 4e D&D book I own, they did do an updated Dark Sun supplement, which is like one of my favorite settings of all time. They have not yet, to my knowledge, done it in 5e, and I'm kind of okay with that because I've seen what they've done to some of my other favorite settings in 5e, and I'm not happy.
But anyway,
I digress.
Yeah, back to, it was, especially in the first edition, it was all the games, you had a World of Darkness, which had the mortal rules, and then all the other books were kind of supplements, like, Mage, Changeling, whatever. They weren't core books. They were like buying in World of Darkness, old World of Darkness terms, whatever. They were like Kindred of the East or Mummy, Mummy the Resurrection or whatever.
How do we feel about this marketing choice overall?
I don't know if it was a marketing choice. I think pluses and I think there's pluses and cons in both ways. Like I think it helps. Crossover was one of the things they really wanted to make. You could make arguments whether or not all the games did. I'll look at you, Promethean, but that definitely helped with crossover. If there's only one set of core rules, and then you're not reprinting them, so you're not rebuying the same rules over and over again. Dark Ages did it too, actually.
Yeah,
like I kind of like that. If you're going to play multiple, like be into multiple of them, which I would be, just who I am. If I'm going to be, I might buy it as a curiosity, and maybe I would have just bought the World of Darkness if I was just not into that style of gaming very much. But if I'm into that, I'm probably going to be buying multiple core books anyway, so I'm fine with it, personally.
Yeah. I mean, when I say it's a marketing choice, fundamentally, everybody is going to be spending twice as much on their first game. And that...
But they'll get more than they would get normally.
Will they?
Yeah, like...
I feel like if you're going to buy the World of Darkness core book to get that core rule set, and then you go out and buy the core, the mostly core book for the splat that you want to actually play, then that first book you've bought, really, I mean, I do know people that were invested in doing Mortals games, and for that, sure.
Oh, I played more World of Darkness games than any of the spin-offs. Yeah.
Fair, yeah. But I think the majority of people treated that first core book as like the gateway into what they really wanted to be playing. And so it does, and I mean, bear in mind too, like at the time I was fresh out of college and unemployed, so the idea of spending twice as much on these things was like so I was a little resentful.
I like it. I think it was,
we just figured it out. We didn't even bother buying the core
Oh no, I totally got the core book, and it was a really good book, so I'm kind of sad they didn't do it in second edition, but
eventually I read it. But at the time, it was like, yeah, we've played enough old World of Darkness that we can figure out how the new ones work. Like,
that would have been rough.
We sorted it out.
Yeah.
Regardless, the idea of easing crossover, I've never felt like crossover games are something that I'm really into, but I can appreciate that other people want that. What I dispute, though, is the importance of mechanics in that. Like, okay, figuring out the mechanics of how your werewolf is going to interact with your changeling along the same rule set, fine. But ultimately, tell me why these two characters are working together in the first place, or why they have similar goals. And it feels just as artificial as multi-splat crossover does in Old World of Darkness.
I think, from my understanding, stuff like Contagion Chronicles and whatnot brought that in more, and the God Machine and all that stuff headed a bit more of a tie-in. But
Crisis on Infinite Worlds of Darkness.
Yes, it's more like when Batman and Superman team up. It's not like Crisis.
All right,
but yeah, the execution had issues. I definitely agree, and the constraints of it, I feel like sometimes like, we'll get into this more with Lost, but trying to impinge like a morality system on every game felt kind of. It kind of worked in Werewolf the Forsaken.
What was their morality system?
Oh, what was it?
I've literally never read Werewolf the Forsaken.
Oh, I can't remember now. I wasn't planning for that. That one was Harmony. There we go.
Okay.
That one was okay. Using it in Mage felt weird.
Weird, you say?
Yes. Let's go back to Changeling, yeah.
On that note, in terms of how the games are similar to each other, obviously the myth and fairy tale inspirations are there. So for anyone who hasn't played Lost, the base splats. All right, I'm gonna do this. I'm not gonna be able to do it alphabetically probably, but I'm gonna try. You have the beasts, the darklings, the elementals, the fairest, the ogres. Oh, what's the last? The wizened. Oh, and the what are they called? The Grims, who I think got introduced later. And each of those kind of plays into a fairy tale trope. So not like a specific myth in the way, or a specific body of myths that you might get in Dreaming, but sort of a general role within these kind of fairy stories. The more specific ones are found in the subdivisions, which are called, of course, kiths. And they certainly did not solve the bloat problem.
I've seen people approach. Honestly, I would have preferred they just had kiths, and like, you know, you can keep it in the background, but it felt very, again, cookie cutter formulaic. That's like one of the things people complain about. We mentioned 4th edition D&D. Like 4th edition D&D had the same sort of thing, but it didn't front and center it even quite as much as these books do. Like, it just leaves me, in actually all the games, it always left me going, why should anybody care about this particular axis? Like the, what did it was called again in Changeling?
The seeming.
Yeah, the seeming.
Or, seeming means something different here.
Yeah, the seeming, or it feels very artificial. And it's like, does anyone care about this in-game?
The weird thing is that the other games, like, I mean, when you start with Vampire the Requiem, you had a 5x5 system, I think they called it, where you had like your clan and your covenant, and you could
your bloodline.
And your blood. Well, yeah, and then eventually you had the multiplication of bloodlines and everything.
Well, they had in the core book was still a bloodline. That's where the formula started.
Yeah, but eventually there was bloodline bloat in Requiem in the same way that you had kith bloat. So it's interesting that they kind of didn't do that from the start in Changeling.
I think they did. You had your seeming. The seeming is clan, court is covenant, and kith is bloodline. It's 1-to-1.
I suppose, but you only have 4 courts. I mean, putting aside supplements where they introduce alternative court systems, you only have 4 courts, and it's not like those ever get expanded. Like, I'm pretty sure new covenants came into the mix at some point, right?
Yeah.
So, and then on the other end of the things, you have Mage, which I don't know that they ever went past the, whatever it was, the 5x5, whatever the 5 things were called, the orders.
Yeah, well, no, they kind of did, but because there was 4 proper ones, and then this other like Caitiff one, and then plus there's the antagonist stuff. But
in any case, we're getting away from the similarities. So there are still the myth and fairy tale inspirations. You do still have glamour as energy that changelings need to fuel themselves and do magic things. It is still strongly associated with dreams and emotions,
but not as strongly, I'd say, with as dreams and emotions.
Maybe not as strong. Yeah. It's one of the vectors by which they can get glamour.
Yep.
However, they don't have a permanent glamour trait. They instead have a weird trait. Different associations there. And then you've still got the notion of having a fey form being your true self. As a sidebar, I like how seeming as a term does get its semantics changed to mean like the true face rather than the human facade.
Yep.
But anyway, so you have your true fey form hidden inside the human one, and you can drop it when you need to show off your power or whatever. So you do get that caught between two worlds kind of mentality that you get in Dreaming, just with a much different timbre to it.
But it is more like it actually was more of Hessian there, or Dark Ages Fae. There's a lot of crossover, like similarities to Dark Ages Fae, I find.
Yeah, when we did our Dark Ages Fae episode, and I kept saying, "Oh, this feels like a midpoint between Dreaming and Lost." I think that's one of the things.
Yeah, the 4 seasonal courts, which to me, maybe they fixed this in supplements or explained it, but I'm always like, it didn't make sense to me to have a PC group where we're all different courts like that. Both of those games, it's like a barrier to doing that, way more so than being Seelie and Unseelie in Changeling the Dreaming.
I don't think they fixed it now.
Okay, so I'm like, why do they?
Yeah.
I mean, Covenants are the same problem in Requiem, so.
So let's talk about differences then, because that is one of the key ones. Maybe the biggest difference, though, is just what a changeling is. I mean, it's the same term, but meaning totally different things, in the sense that in Lost, you are not a fae from birth awakening at some point in your mortal life going through Chrysalis. You're a mortal who's been abducted into Arcadia, which also has a rather different tone here, but at least still kind of means home of the fae, and then transformed over time by your contact with the gentry or the keepers, those inscrutable beings who dwell there. And then you come back kind of like warped and broken and try to rebuild your life, but you're now irreversibly tied to the source of your trauma.
Yeah.
And the keepers may send huntsmen after you, so you have to keep a low profile.
You have a fetch that replaced your old life potentially, and
people seem to get really invested in the idea that like a game called Changeling must have this mythological kidnapping trope.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've heard that argument a lot.
Well, first of all, if that was supposed to fit it for Changeling the Lost, then you'd be playing a fetch, not.
Which, don't get me wrong, that's a great story to play. That's a wonderful game to play.
I'd be more interested in playing that. That's actually one of my issues. This is not me saying this is a bad thing about the game. This is purely my interests, things that interest me and things that interest me less. What you are in Lost doesn't interest me as much to play. I don't want to play a human who went through trauma and then has come back and is dealing with... That's just not interesting to me very much. It's not what I like about... I like other fairy RPGs that could be very different from either of these two. But like, you're an alien trying to fit into the world. You're a person who's been made other, trying to come to terms with... I'm like, that's not the kind of, I don't know, interaction that interests me as much. But
I think I have to be in the exact right mood to play a fetch game. That's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I'd be much more likely to playing a fetch game. That's like totally be my jam, especially if they altered it slightly to make it a bit more PC focused.
And of course, both are changelings in Dark Ages Fae.
Yeah.
So
there's all kinds of changelings.
Yeah. Regarding the nature of the true fae, I don't know if you can speak to their similarity to like exalted fair folk, but
I'd say there's some... Mechanically, no, they're not very similar at all. But their psychology and their metaphysics are a bit more. Both of them are weird. They're like if nothing put on a face.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. Like there is no internality to both in a certain way.
Yeah.
So
I like that.
I mean, Exalted the Fair Folk, I think, is a lot more playable as PCs, deliberately such. And that's like totally my jam. But like the Gentry, I'm like, I can see why this doesn't really work as a player character. Not even just mechanically. Just don't really have mechanics in the same way. Yeah.
I've sometimes thought of them as being like White Court Fomorians, because I don't think that they should be as completely inscrutable as the Green Court, but also not as one track as the Red Court. So I like them as these cunning manipulators so far beyond the mortal ken that they're doing all these sort of plots and games that only they can see. And they probably don't even see themselves as adversarial.
Yeah.
So,
well, I don't think they see themselves from my...
Or that. Yeah. And of course, you have some changelings in Lost who are almost like apologists for their captors.
Yeah.
One recurring thread is that they're tied to stories and oaths in a way that, again, kind of resembles Dark Ages Fae. But the upshot of all of this is that Arcadia is generally not somewhere you want to go back to.
No.
And the hedge that surrounds it, the analog to the Dreaming, is like one big booby-trapped maze. So you can, if you compare it to the Dreaming, there's some overlap in the sense that the Dreaming can also be treacherous and the hedge can also be wondrous. But I think I lean towards saying the hedge, which has its beasts and tainted fruit and lurking huntsmen and whatnot, there's much less room for like the whimsy and epic quests that you get in Dreaming.
Although the Goblin Market, oh my goodness, I need that.
Goblin Markets are great.
Yeah.
And I mean, Goblin Markets are easily portable into Dreaming too.
Yeah.
You know? Read Stardust by Neil Gaiman. It has everything you need.
I mean, actually, that Dark Ages Fae has a Goblin Market too, doesn't it?
Yeah. Lastly, obviously, the lack of meta plot is a big deal compared with Dreaming, because Dreaming, you have the Immortal Eyes saga, and then David's disappearance, and
Yeah.
then the War on Concordia, and then the Fomorians rising. And I'm hard pressed to think of like a single widespread event in Lost at
Yeah.
all.
But I'm okay with that. The local nature of it, like with Changeling the Dreaming, first of all, I think the meta plot only really mattered that much if you're playing into Concordia.
Sure, yeah.
And like the whole Fomorian thing, that always felt like this thing's gonna happen, but if they actually did it, that's now time of judgment, right? Like it's not.
Well, like see also Gehenna, you know.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but it's the end of the world. Like that's not really a meta plot. That's a looming threat. That's just sort of ever present.
Existential.
Yeah.
Millenarianism.
But like who happens to be king or whatever. Like I kind of like that in Changeling the Dreaming, but I don't know why I like it. Like it doesn't feel like the kind of thing I would normally like in a role playing game. And in Lost, I'm okay with not having it. It's just you still in your city you would have events that have happened and are continuing to happen.
Yeah.
You just don't need the book giving them to you.
It just seems like it's a lot more work, especially for a first-time storyteller. It's a lot of heavy lifting to do. Maybe it's a minor point in the overall scheme of things, but I try to think about like if this is somebody's first World of Darkness game, how are they going to react to that?
I just realized I've been gaming for like over 10 years before I ever encountered like a module that could be part of my everything was just the GM coming up with stuff and then things happen and things go crazy and players completely derail stuff. That's just how gaming was for me for so long. And then
me too.
I'd sort of heard of these D&D modules, but it was like whatever, that sounds kind of, I'm playing for a role-playing game, not a book.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, this is going to sound a little bit, I don't know, choose your adjective here. There are storytellers and players who, whether it's World of Darkness or not, I think they are terrified of the Golden Rule. Because I think the Golden Rule, it should be spelled out in every role-playing game. Like, if there's something that doesn't work for you, change it. This is a game. The staff of the gaming company are not going to come, well, unless Wizards of the Coast might. They're not going to come knock on your door or send the Pinkertons to come tell you to stop your game because you're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
But there are people who I think are, petrified in some cases of doing it wrong, and they really do want those guidelines, and that's fine.
And when it comes to the rules, I kind of get it.
Even setting though,
but
too.
Like the rules, the setting, you don't need the. That's the thing. Like setting golden, everything should be golden rule for setting for me.
But see, you and I know that.
Yeah, yeah. The rules are. I don't know if I haven't fully read Changeling the Lost enough to know if it would be more. But given the companies that made it, I would not expect it to be more. You're going to need to do some golden ruling. Let's put it that way.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. And we don't need to get deep into the mechanics, but in terms of like broader changes.
Yeah.
So some of the things that New World of Darkness did are, I think they streamlined the abilities in the first edition. Definitely in the second, there's far fewer abilities, and there's a rehash of the way they work. They replaced a couple of the attributes.
Yep.
XP is handled differently.
Yeah. Well, they got rid of XP in second edition. It was some other thing, right? The beats.
It's now you just like get certain dots for story beats.
Yep.
Thing. Anyway, merits work differently in first edition.
I like the first edition merits and flaws. Those merits are pretty similar. It's flaws that are big difference. You get XP when their flaw matters.
Merits are kind of, they're similar to backgrounds in a way, right?
Yeah, they're all 1 to 5 dots. But...
Yeah. For Lost in particular, you still have things that resemble birthrights.
Yep.
And the weird mechanic has interesting bits to it in that it's your glamour equivalent, but you don't want it to get too high because you can get addicted to glamour, or you can attract the attention of the true fae, or you might start becoming more like them than you want to be.
Yeah, and I think you also get mortal problem interactions, don't you? Or... Yeah.
The magic system is notably somewhat different. You have contracts instead of arts and realms.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on contracts?
Metaphysically, I think it's kind of neat.
Yes, I can agree with that.
Mechanically, it just felt like generic powers to me.
There's just so many.
Yeah, it's just kind of, here's some powers, you do it.
Bloat again.
Like, it just felt like a spell list, kind of.
Yeah. And imagine, like, if there were dozens and dozens of arts, each with very specific powers. Or really, it's even more like, in Requiem, I think they eventually topped 100 disciplines, because it was like each bloodline needs its own distinctive one.
Yeah.
And I found that...
Yeah, like C20... that's a fair number of arts, but like we got 2 more. Like I wouldn't even probably use them in the game. Like it's enough arts. It's
yeah. Well, consider that almost every Changeling the Dreaming cantrip has at least 4 different angles in that you're using the realms, multiplied by 5 levels, optionally multiplied by 5 levels of 2 modifiers. And then if you kind of stick with bunks and having bunks be distinctive and different and people coming up with them, that's such a wide range. When I played Lost, I felt like I was using the same tricks over and over and over. And that was less engaging.
Yeah.
So that's one criticism I have.
The same thing happened in Dark Ages. I know I was running it, not playing it, but the cantrips in Dark Ages just felt like that. It was just the same thing over and over. And then the unleashings where it actually was, and I could tell the people who played more like D&D type players,
they loved it.
Characters cantrips, and the people who like played Mage the Ascension were like taking all the unleashing all the time. So
and there's room for both, and they both create different tones. But I think part of what made World of Darkness as a set of games distinct, especially Mage, maybe really Mage and not the others, like Vampire and Werewolf are pretty much, here's the power, this is how it works. But then Mage opened the doors to, no, you can be more flexible and improvisational with this. And I feel like once that genie is out of the bottle, that's what I want.
Well, Changing the Dreaming I like because it's flexible in a different way.
Yeah, Dreaming, I would say, is not as completely open as Mage can be, but it's certainly a lot more flexible than Blood Magic and Vampire, for example. So overall, there are a lot of other differences. Can we agree that Changeling the Lost is the World of Darkness game the least like its predecessor?
In terms of the ones that have the same start name, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, even like Demon is more like its predecessor.
Well, and I haven't played either Demon, so
I think you might like the
Descent.
Yeah, Descent. I don't think you. I know I get why you don't like it, but Descent doesn't have the same issues that you would have that you had with the Fallen.
I just never got to it. I mean,
I've read a bit of it, and it's neat, but
all right. Well, I'll give it a look. But so when you think about like Vampire and Mage, at least they have the same concept between games in that Vampire in both versions, you're a bloodsucker who's been embraced, and Mage in both versions, you're the inheritor of a magical tradition that has awakened.
Yeah.
There are differences in that, if I remember correctly, Requiem is kind of less fixated on things like working your way up the generation ladder.
Yeah, because there is no generation. Yeah.
Awakening, you're more or less all working within the same paradigm, but the protagonists are not metaphysically entirely different in the same way that Lost Changelings are from Dreaming Changelings.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why the fan bases didn't really come together as easily. So I have heard an argument made that the Changeling way in Changeling the Dreaming might have originally resembled what happened to the Lost Fae, and so that maybe the Lost Fae eventually reincarnate in the way that the Dreaming Fae do, but we don't have enough information about the deep history in Dreaming, and there's not enough overall world building in Lost to.
But I mean, if Lost did that, I feel like that would have come up, like if there was reincarnation. Like that should...
Yeah, well, eventually, sure. Yeah.
And I mean, the whole Lost thing's been going on a long time, hasn't it? It wasn't just like last week the first Lost showed up, was it?
Right. Yeah. But like the world building is so minimal in Lost that you could have that.
Yeah.
You could introduce that. And you could cross over themes from one to the other.
Yeah.
But I kind of feel like, why would you?
I know one person in our Discord was looking into, but I think they might have been turned off by the implications. But the idea that, you know, you could take Lost, you could definitely as a homebrew, like in your own game, basically have Lost as pseudo antagonists / unwary allies in a Changeling the Dreaming game. I think that could work. Certainly if you make if you don't make it Arcadia, if you make like some other keeper kind of thing.
The analog that I go to first is the Tithed, because in a very immediate sense, that's who the Lost Fae are in Dreaming.
Yeah.
But I think what might be actually more interesting is if you ran a Thalane game like a Lost game. I think that could be really compelling. So I'm putting a pin in that for later thoughts. I've just kind of turning that over today.
We'll talk about that. That's an interesting idea. I'm not quite sure what you mean. Yeah. So let's...
Well, I'll come back to that later. But but with the way, when I think about like how changelings operate in the world in each game, with Dreaming, like the mundane world is not just melancholy and tragic, it's toxic.
Yeah.
in the sense of having banality, and the dreaming is home. So like, why would you avoid your heritage, putting aside any, shape of the Tuatha in that one time of judgment scenario, or whether or not there's a civil war in Arcadia, all of that. But then meanwhile, the protagonists of Lost are paranoid and traumatized and
Yeah.
distrustful. So how can you set up like, we're going to have a joust for the Duke in that
Mm-hmm.
kind of environment?
But they seem to have that in Lost too. There seems to be a lot of Lost who are like, oh, I'm cool with this now. Like,
is it like drinking away the pain kind of thing? I don't
no,
know.
it's. I would think of it more like there's some weird superhero settings, like wild cards or something, where like a horrible trauma happened, but now you got crazy superpowers. So like,
Oh, that's Aberrant. So
that's aberrant. Okay, yeah, that's all. But I mean, there's
yeah,
also
no, I'm sure there's others like that too.
yeah, but it doesn't seem like. I think saying that all Lost are just broken PTSD victims who are unable to recover or something is about like saying Changeling the Dreaming. They're all just say you don't believe in them and they die, kind of.
I think, all right, so here's my comment on that dichotomy.
Yeah.
I think Lost specifically doesn't want to be that expression of Changeling. It acknowledges that there are many ways to process and overcome trauma, and that gives you the diversity
Mm-hmm.
within the game. But it's like, that's the one spot that it tries not to approach.
Mm.
And even though Dreaming came first and never had Don't Be Changeling Lost as part of its design goals, I think the reverse is actually not true. Like, I don't think anything in Dreaming says you should not play a character whose relationship with their fayness is about overcoming trauma. I mean, we get examples of storyteller characters where that's their
That
story.
kind of borders on Daunting, though. A lot of Daunting
Yeah,
stories.
yeah. I mean, as a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I'm not willing to say that means Dreaming has a wider breadth than
Mm-hmm.
Lost does necessarily.
Yeah.
But I do kind of come back to that when I think about it.
Yeah, but it's also Lost seems like you're not supposed to go back to your mortal life. It seems like you're not supposed to have like a real mortal side. Like
Yeah.
Dreaming seems more grounded in the real world than Lost to me.
Well, this is the big thing for me. And this is me bringing up themes. So, dreaming to me is about finding balance, like I've
Mm-hmm.
said many times, balance between the human and the Fae side, keeping the spark of glamour alive in the face of banality, and the dreaming as your first and last home, as well as the importance of community. That's also a major thing in dreaming. Human flesh is like something you've borrowed for a while.
Yeah.
You deal with nostalgia and wonder and nightmare, and everything is kind of
Well, it's
larger
not.
than
I mean, if
life.
you're not playing an Arcadian She, it's more than just what you've borrowed for a while. You're just as human as you are Fae in Changeling the Dreaming. If you're a changeling.
All right, fair. Well,
Yeah.
this incarnation is something you've borrowed for a
Yeah.
while. So, Lost, on the other hand, is about recovering your identity, incorporating this new supernatural aspect of it, which you may not really be happy about because it might be this
Mm-hmm.
constant reminder of your trauma. But it's also about being an individual and stepping carefully everywhere you go, especially the Hedge, for the rest of your natural life, or until you get powerful enough to take on the Keepers, I guess. It's nightmare with less of the wonder, or at least the wonder
Mm-hmm.
seems very rarely unadulterated by darkness. It's about adapting and moving on. And all of the above are valuable and important
Yeah.
themes that can go in really interesting directions, but they don't overlap
There's.
much.
I think there's one place where they overlap. Found family.
Overlap, but
Yeah.
still
If
not.
anything, I'd say Lost is more found family than Dreaming, but
But it's found family with a very particular
mm-hmm.
angle to it.
Yeah, I guess you're all similar. Like Dreaming, you have all these different kiths, you have all this different stuff. It's very different kind of people kind of bringing together. Like it feels more like queer spaces that I'm used to. Like we're not even just queer spaces that have lots of queer people that I'm used to. Where Lost is like, okay, we're a support group or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dreaming is like a family reunion.
Mm-hmm.
Lost is like strength in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the
Yeah.
vibe I get from each of them. Do you think there was anything, and I know I kind of bring this up from time to time, was there anything outside the world of gaming that you think influenced this shift, like culturally or historically? Whether it was the move from the mid 90s to the late 2000s, or like pre to post internet, or just White Wolf changing? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, mechanically, there was the whole shift in gaming to the general thing about the
online.
the template stuff and the
Oh.
let's try to make it like make the attributes even like are more. There's like a
power, finesse, resilient, or whatever it
yeah,
is.
kind of every yeah, like all
yeah.
that. Like let's try to make it all fit specific, which I don't think is as much a thing now, but I think it was then pretty strongly.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is an American company. 9/11 must have had something to do with it, but
yeah,
I don't really know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Social media arrived in between the two games, so like, who knows?
Yeah, well, not just social media arrived. When I started playing Changeling the Dreaming, I was online. The other Changeling the Dreaming players were, but like most people weren't still.
Yeah.
When Lost came out, like especially when Lost Second Edition came out, like everybody's online now. Like it, not being online would be like really weird.
Yeah. So. Do you know, you just reminded me, I was going to say I should write a media studies paper about this someday, but something else that like just dislodged in my brain. I've been listening to a lot of Irish traditional music this week because St. Patrick's Day is coming up. And it occurred to me that when you look at kind of the inspirations for dreaming back in the day, I don't know, we'd have to do a poll or something, but I kind of feel like what inspires people now musically, but maybe also in terms of like TV and film, it's a lot more eclectic and much less traditional.
Oh,
and I feel like that's kind of like somewhere in the air when I think about these things.
I think if you look at actually the 1E core book for Lost for sources of inspiration, they're more focused on folklore. Like there's definitely some things that are in both, but Lost fits more what I feel like is the folklore purist things.
Yes,
the pure side of. They're like, well, this is you got to really. I want to represent this particular version of this story I heard from either my grandma or read in this book, right? And dreaming, it's like, let's just take some inspiration, but let's run with it.
Yeah. That's interesting to me because that makes me think Changeling is actually the more postmodern game.
Yeah.
Or Dreaming is the more
well, that's because we're now postmodern.
Right, yeah.
I don't know what we are now. We've eaten our own tail or something.
I made that comment to a friend of mine at the bookstore recently because I was like, man, all of these books coming out now that are more or less straight up retellings of Greek myths. Like you have the Circe novel and they're modernized in the sense of they're written with modern language and kind of the modern psychology stuff, but they don't really deviate and they're not really transposed in any way to make a commentary on their structure.
They also don't fit capital M modern either, like the older pre-postmodern stuff.
They're not modernist by any means.
No.
So anyway, again, putting a pin in that for later thoughts. But you're reminding me to move to the last point on my list here with moods. And the fact that people often say Lost is darker and therefore de facto better, both of those things strike me as a failure of imagination.
Yeah.
Which we've talked about before.
I feel it's more like Lost has a way turned down the contrast rather than being darker.
Oh, I like that. That's a good...
Yeah. Maybe on average it's darker. Like
Yeah.
But Dreaming has like extreme darkness you wouldn't get in Lost. Like it's all over the place in Changeling. Lost is
an extreme brightness.
Like tonally is much more samey.
Yeah. And I don't think Lost needs to be dark. It's just kind of it starts from that place of lower contrast and then doesn't really give you enough scaffolding to take it as far out as Dreaming does.
Here's the problem. Not the problem, but here's what they did. New World of Darkness, at least for up through Lost, like you could make an argument about Demon Descent doesn't really fit this. It totally doubled down on the whole personal horror thing, and it tried doing that in all their games. Like
I 100% agree.
Which also, like after reading Promethean, I'm like, why would you want Lost's personal horror than Promethean's? Sort of capped it.
Oh, but because the difference is that Promethean is probably the most hopeful game out of any of them.
Yeah.
And it builds towards something. Lost is like a long fall as your weird stat goes up, depending on how you want to play it.
Actually, there we go. Promethean's more of the kind of thing I want from a fairy RPG than Lost is.
Okay.
I want that.
Interesting.
I like the alien outsider mindset. That's what I want in my fairies.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, Lost, I guess it's relentless in things being like twisted or corrupt or just dank.
Yeah. It's more relentless.
Yeah. And it starts from this place of foreboding, whereas dreaming, I feel like, starts from a place of bittersweetness. So, sure, in layman's terms, maybe that's darker in the sense that it's closer to classic horror tropes than drama, but I dispute that that's inherently better.
Yeah.
Related to our morality episode, I don't think any of that makes either game inherently more or less morally complex. But I do feel like we live in an era where people mistake the mood of something for moral complexity, and then in turn mistake that for good storytelling. Like, you can tell excellent stories with allegorical characters and tropes, and you can tell terrible ones with morally ambiguous characters.
Yep.
So, I don't know. It just rankles me when people make these kinds of claims.
Yep.
And ultimately, Lost leaves a lot in the hands of the storyteller. And so maybe all these people saying Lost is inherently better for the point of departure it has, maybe they all had awesome storytellers to make that a reality, but I don't think the game itself really bears that out.
I think I'm not saying all Lost fans, but the Lost fans the ones who really talk about how much they like Lost more than Changeling, I think it just comes down to you can pull out whatever book of fairy tales or whatever book of myth or whatever, and you can make your like that one creature thing as your character. Even though they're not going to be the same, but it'd be someone you can make a human who's turned somewhat into that thing in Lost, and you can like nail down all the details a lot better. And Changing the Dreaming, it's more open. Like, it's not going to map as well to...
Yeah. Lost wants you to do that.
Yeah.
Dreaming lets you do that, but doesn't...
It doesn't help you quite as much. You got to pick a few merits and flaws in Dreaming and hope we got the right kith, and it might not totally fit.
Have a flexible storyteller.
Yeah.
One more minor note. Obviously, the aesthetic is very different from Dreaming. There's no rainbows here or anything, but I do overall kind of like the aesthetic of Lost.
Yep.
In terms of its artwork and its iconography and stuff. So there's that.
I do think like the Hedge in Arcadia, and you want to change the name Arcadia, obviously, but like you could all stick all this stuff in the Dreaming too. I think you could mine this for a lot of things in Lost for your Changeling game. I know we said it's different, but like the NPC elements, especially, I think could be mined if you want to.
Yeah. In terms of difference, like that's the final takeaway for me. They're fundamentally different, but still good games that speak to different ideas and provide different player experiences. Neither game's elements are impossible to model in the other, but I do feel like each one more or less handles its own brief correctly, you know? And I wonder if at the point in time when this game was released, it fulfilled a need that some Dreaming players had, but certainly not all in terms of like what they were looking for from the game.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, like, do you think anyone has run numbers on how many of the players who jumped from Dreaming to Lost started with a World of Darkness game other than Changeling? Like, how many of the vampire players...
Well, again, I don't know how many people jumped from Dreaming to Lost. I think a lot of Dreaming players who stopped playing Changeling to Dreaming moved on to other things entirely, like non-White Wolf.
Yeah. Like, for me, Dreaming wasn't my first World of Darkness game, but I suppose what I needed from Dreaming wasn't something that Lost was especially interested in providing up front. And I think what that was and is centered on world building and a certain feeling of community. So
for me, it's banality and glamour. That's the core things I like about
that too. That too. Yeah. And I've played a few different Lost games and enjoyed most of them and had fun creating characters. And I think there is a lot of potential to explore. If I had time for both, I'd happily do both. But the depths of Dreaming are still unplumbed enough that I'm happy to...
I would definitely, for the right group, play a game of Lost more so than I would for some other games, right? With the same group. I could never see myself co-hosting a podcast for Changeling the Lost. Like, having the enthusiasm to do that is not hitting the right buttons for me.
That's fair. Next season, we'll figure this out. But...
Yeah. Oh, and I just want to say one more thing. I hate how on Facebook, the most popular Changeling the Dreaming community is also the most popular Changeling the Lost community, because it's both. And they keep making posts, and if you don't know both games very well, people will start replying for the wrong, thinking it's the wrong game and stuff, and it gets messy.
There should be a way to flag these somehow.
Yeah, but it's like, why are we in the same group? And people tried to start up different groups, but everyone just keeps going into the same.
Anyway. I think that speaks to the massive interest that, like, if nothing else, I'm glad that Lost kept the Fae in the conversation. Because when Promethean came out, those of us who remembered it went, vampire, werewolf, mage, wraith, changeling, it's like, oh no, they're not doing wraith. Oh no, are they going to can changeling? Like, are they not even going to bother with it? But then they went through with it, and then it was wildly successful. So it's like, okay, yeah, people are into this and they want this. So, but on that subject in particular, we do have a few questions from the Discord, and I think the first one speaks to this very directly. So, Luna Andromeda Vebe asks, I've noticed that the small subculture that Changeling the Lost can inspire of, this is way superior in every way to that light-hearted Changeling the Dreaming, has dwindled in my own experience, and people who still act like that seem to be more and more disliked in the wider fandom. Does this match your own experiences? I'm glad to hear it's turned out that way.
I'd say so too. I'd say what did that was Changeling the Dreaming 20th Anniversary Edition. And we'll get to that.
Right on.
I don't think either of us love all of it, but it definitely addressed a lot of the things people didn't. The ones who like opened up the second edition core book, saw the bear holding a balloon, and then closed it.
Right.
Like, it addressed those people.
Well, I tend to find that kind of all or nothing thinking pretty insufferable.
Yeah.
But I'm just baffled by why people say these. I doubt any of them are listening.
Well,
so
both of them now are kind of not entirely supported by their publisher.
Yeah, they're both over now, so we got to stick together. How's that for Found Family?
There's absolutely no plans of getting a next edition of either of the games. So
yeah, given how things have been going with the current ones.
Yeah.
So then I'm going to preface this next one by saying the slight content warning here for abuse. Glamour Weaver comments, I mentioned this on the ableism episode room, but it strikes me that Dreaming and Lost both address the history of ableist abuse inseparable from the Changeling myth's roots in almost mirror ways. Dreaming takes on the divergence as a central theme and changes who the villain of the story is, with those not accepting their changelings and trying to force them to conform to society's expectations being the bad guys, instead of the protagonist trying to get their real loved one back. Real in quotes. Lost comes at it by centering the abuse, with the inversion being that the gentry are the ones representing it, and the fetch are, instead of the divergent party, they're, if anything, the ones representing the willed conformity to the expectations and desires of others, while the taken party is the survivor with all the trauma and baggage that other people don't necessarily want to accept and deal with. There's a lot there. It's really complex. But I think it's a really interesting point that gets to at least part of the heart of why these games feel so different. So yeah, and related to the point earlier about the kidnapping trope, it's interesting how people will insist on that, like you said, be the purists, without looking at the real world, sociological, often religious motivations for it. Because changelings as a myth have historically been a way to enforce conformity. And I surmise that's part of why banality is such a central part of Dreaming. They were an excuse to punish people for their difference. And in Dreaming, the whole world is doing that, like metaphysically. So the game inverts it by celebrating that difference.
Yeah, I still think that the myth, though, does fit the fetch, not the changelings.
Yeah. And as a queer person, I am here for celebrating that difference from the protagonist's perspective. Like, absolutely.
Yeah.
So then with Lost, I'm realizing now the subtitle of the game is kind of an interesting choice, because the Lost protagonists are the ones who kind of are lost in the myths, in that they're neither the abductor nor the true changeling, the left behind being. They're the abductee who might come back, might not, but will certainly be different.
Yeah. I think if you're also like, one way of framing that might, Dreaming is the people who were always different, putting aside Arcadian She, different from the beginning, although maybe you didn't realize it. Lost is you were more of a typical person who then, because of trauma, is now outside of society.
Yeah. The bit in here about the villain of Dreaming kind of flipping it around into the protagonist trying to get their real loved one back. Kind of like when we've talked about autumn people who mean well, or like just parents who are scared that their child is like running off and whatever. I don't know if there is an analog in Lost for that. Like, there's things about, your fetch might be ingrained into your mortal family now and things like that, but it all feels kind of optional in Lost in a way that it doesn't in Dreaming, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Lost is, this happened to you, now what do you do? And it's an open-ended question.
Yeah. So Nadine asks, something that always frustrated me about Lost is the way that it strips away many of the elements that made Dreaming really shine. Would it have been better if they didn't call it Changeling at all? I think the games can and should coexist in the same universe, but the naming convention makes it, if not impossible, very difficult. In short, I think Lost is a great concept, but I hate that it replaced Dreaming as a concept entirely.
I don't think they really could fit in the same universe exactly, because the world of darkness and the other world of darkness are not the same world at all. They're very different.
Yeah.
Changeling aside. So the name is like, it's almost, it feels like it's being cute. Like, it's like a bit too winky. It's a little bit annoying. Like, it's like, oh, we're changeling, but a different changeling. Oh, we have weird, but a different weird. Oh, we have a slightly different glamour. Oh, it's like, okay.
Yeah.
The name even doesn't bug me as much as like some of the terms. Because like these are not common terms that you'd have to use if all of them if you're making fairy story.
Yeah.
You didn't have to use seemings. You didn't have to use kith. But
there were options.
Yep.
But I agree in terms of the universe. Like, the only points of connection you can kind of shoehorn in are the Lost Fae in the context of Dreaming are the tithed-ish.
Yeah.
And the Dreaming Fae in the context of Lost are, I guess, those Fae who are all about how cool the Gentry are.
Well, no,
but they're so divergent.
Like, trying to do kith. Okay, you could do Arcadian She, and it'd be terrifying in Lost.
Yeah.
But if you tried to do like Changeling Way, I think it would ruin the themes of Lost. Like, people would, if you came out with a supplement, people would be like, "What are you doing? This is not." It would be as good as like, oh, let's create pro-banality changelings who are actually decent people in Changeling the Dreaming. Like, that's not fitting the game.
Yeah, those characters exist in Lost, but I don't think I don't even know if you have the option to actually play them. Similarly, the Tithed, I don't think anything in Dreaming is pointing you towards you should play a Tithed character. So like, they exist conceptually, but they're so far out of whack with what everybody else is doing that it's like, this isn't really going to work.
Yeah, the closest, again, like Lost, there's certain kind of edgelordy Lost character concepts that also work as Dauntain.
There you go.
Yeah.
I do agree that it does kind of suck how Lost replaced Dreaming as what people thought of with the term Changeling.
Yeah.
But, being out of print for 15 years will do that.
Well, now I think that's not the case anymore.
It does seem like it's shifting back.
And also, when you say Changeling to most people, they're going to not think of any White Wolf game. So
Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, or other shapeshifters, or
that
weird movie from the 80s, or...
Yeah. Atlas asks, how could I run goblin fruits in Dreaming? I mean, they're basically just edible treasures, right?
Yeah. There you go.
See Andrew Goodman's book Roots of Legend on the Storyteller's Vault. Fref asks, I'm just curious how you see, correct me if I'm wrong, the way that kiths are done in Changeling the Lost. Because when I've played Lost with my players, they seem to enjoy the varied ways a kith can take shape instead of them being rather rigged in their appearance or origins.
Yeah.
We have talked about this before. I'm going to hammer my point again about the emphasis on individuality in Lost versus the emphasis on collectivism in Dreaming. But again, like, I don't think there's any rule forbidding you from doing little twists to your Famine in Dreaming.
I don't think the kiths are more varied in Lost than they are in Dreaming.
I think what it comes down to, from what I've seen, it's really just cosmetically.
Yeah.
When we were talking about Dark Ages Fae with like the lesser features, for example.
But like, I think this also helps that we've done. I think part of the problem with Dreaming is people who've only read C20 haven't seen enough changes, right? But like, we've looked at all the kith art.
That's true.
Across all the books, and there's many ways of making really weird, ugly trolls that don't look right. And
see, Kithbook trolls.
What are the red cap teeth like? Lots of changes there. Like, there's all kinds of things you could do. They're not even described as being all the same. So
yeah.
And I do think like the kiths, I don't know, I didn't get the impression kiths and Lost were that varied either. Like the seemings, yes.
Well, because the kiths are almost more, not roles necessarily, but like metaphysical qualities rather than your appearance.
What, you're talking about seemings or kiths?
Kiths.
In Changing the Lost?
In Lost, because like, for example, if you're an elemental, that's your seeming.
Yep.
And you can be an elemental of whatever and manifest it however you want. But then if you are as my character was in one game, a hell diver, that's more about your, it's like your class in D&D,
Yep.
So it's less to do about what you look like and what myth you play.
That makes sense. Because like, in a sense, from a Changeling perspective, like it's Changeling Dreaming perspective, it's almost like Lost. Every kith is its own kith. Like every individual character is its own kith. You're not from a common origin. You were changed in certain ways, but
which is that cultural shift that bemuses me.
Yep.
And I don't know if it was caused by the game or if the game played into it, but it is noticeable.
Well, I don't think it was caused by the game because it's not just in Changeling.
No, well, yeah, there you go. And it's especially noticeable when players who believe making their character visually unique is very important and get very annoyed when someone else, especially a storyteller, isn't as enthusiastic about it. So, anyway.
But I still had the character, somebody playing a character in a Changeling game who made a she with the amnesia flaw with wings that was feathered wings.
Right.
And who
Angel Fae.
You thought he was an angel. Yeah. So.
Yep. Our last question, Seb asks, what are your personal opinions on the nature of the true Fae and the ever-changing nature of Arcadia within Lost versus the vague enigmas presented in the Dreaming? What's your least and most favorite part of each setting? What do you think about the implication that the true Fae in Lost aren't its original inhabitants and took over Arcadia, which kind of parallels how the Tuatha took over the Dreaming? Least and most favorite, I have no idea. There's too many things to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
Tuatha taking over the Dreaming... The jury's honestly still out on that for me. I know that like more and more they pushed towards the Fomorians were like the original primal dreams, and the Tuatha kind of grew out of humanity and took over the reins.
I don't like that either. I like the older one where the Tuatha came into the Dreaming from beyond it.
Yes.
And then colonized. Arcadia was their colony, where the far Dreaming is near Earth, or the deep Dreaming is near Earth, right? Like, I like that. That's just...
But, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways you can go, and the game rightly doesn't come down fully on one or the other.
Well, I come up a lot when I'm talking to World of Darkness fans in general, and they're like, this setting's too big and complicated. I'm like, no, it's too simple and small. Let's make it bigger and more weird and expansive.
Yes. Let's have multiple things be true at the same time.
One of my issues with Dreams and Nightmares was the mechanics were too wonky to make it playable, but you put that aside.
Yeah, otherwise.
Yeah.
With the nature of the true Fae, so one of the NWAD games that I played in was a multi-splat game set in the far future in space. And in that setting, the true Fae were just aliens, full stop. They were from another dimension, and they invaded, and they warped a bunch of people, including my character. And even without the sci-fi angle, I like that for them. They're this other from outside the universe.
Yep.
It's also like that Next Generation episode where like the weird clicky fish aliens are kidnapping the crew of the Enterprise. Anyway, I think the key difference maybe is that the Changelings in Lost do have direct contact with the true Fae in a way that the ones in Dreaming do not and should not. Because the Lost Changelings are fundamentally pointed towards Arcadia, and the Dreaming Changelings, strange as it may sound, are fundamentally pointed towards the Autumn world, I think.
Yep.
And I like that. But I want those distinctions. I think those distinctions are kind of what make each game itself.
Yep.
So that's my opinion on the true Fae.
Yeah, but it's also the Dreaming's way bigger than Arcadia / the Hedge.
Yes.
So
it is infinite. It contains multitudes.
Like, it's not like Arcadia is the center of the Dreaming. It's the center of really the She's Dreaming.
Yeah.
So
it is one of the hearts of the Dreaming. It is not the heart of the Dreaming.
There's like 9 listed hearts, and they're like, these are the ones that Kithane know about.
Yep.
Like, okay, that's.
But thanks for your questions, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Josh, if in the future other people have questions on other nonsense that we're spouting, where can they send them?
Well, they can send us an email, podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. They can join our Discord, discord.me/CTP. They can send us a toot at changelingpod@dice.camp. That's on Mastodon. They can go on our Facebook page for Changeling the Podcast. And they can join our YouTube channel. And there has been people leaving a few comments. I'm trying to reply to some things, but sometimes I don't really know what to say for Changeling the Podcast there.
Click like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube.
Yeah, please do. And did I miss any?
Regardless.
All of the links will be in our show notes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And once again, I'm Josh.
I am the individual known as Puka.
And if you've listened all the way to the end of this episode, you now have to pick a seeming, and you might have to pick a kith soon.
Tune in, drop out, get lost. In preparation for this episode and the inevitable question of which game would be, quote, better, we figured one data point would be to ask the Fae of each line about the largest obstacles facing the other. Our carefully sampled focus group of lost changelings across kiths and seemings pointed to how their dreaming counterparts are caught in an intricate system of political oppression, struggling to maintain mortal ties, and facing the extinction of their kind through the ongoing banalification of the world. The 8 Puka who showed up to the dreaming focus group session merely pointed out that no motley of lost fae has enough hats and cake between them to hold a birthday party for anyone, let alone the lonely nightmare beast that eats away at the foundational human dream of insouciance. It's hard to say which group felt more pity for the other, but in the spirit of equanimity we encourage everyone to play the game that makes them feel fulfilled, no matter how much politicking or surprise partying the sessions do or do not have. We must, however, always recommend more cake. This research was conducted by the intrepid behind-the-scenes team here at Changeling, the podcast, whose efforts are made possible by you, the listeners. Please leave us a review on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience, and you're more than welcome to sign up for our Patreon at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Join the ranks of the patrons we like to shout an extra special thanks to at the end of each episode, who include Derek, Dorcadus, Ellerus, Hugo the Bogperson, Iapol, Jason Vines, Oreo, Roscaboose, Sandchicker, Sija, Terry Robinson, and Tricerabeth. Many thanks as always. For now, exploit the loophole in every contract you can, don't eat any mysterious glowing fruit, beware your fetch, avoid the hedge, and keep on dreaming.